Isaba kay dito kisa-pikas sir ay.
Karon, udtong totok mag-video kay.
O sir, dispiras ba dere sir?
Ay, so mamista mi ugma.
Dere may pista.
Piki ng barbecue. Pistahan
Eh,
ta ng barbecue. Okay, so shall we start? Oh, Junary, pista man sa inyo. Lead the prayer. Okay na? Okay, Junary. Lead the prayer. Uy,
sir,
anong
pero
Oh,
sir, sir, oy.
unsa, unsa? Ha?
Sir, sir, bro, oy.
Dili, ikaw may first.
Paano
Dili
yun?
gid ni siya mag-start. Dili gid ni siya
Paano yun?
Ha? Di ni mag-start. Kaya para i-guide mo mag-report. Uy, nga nang magkatawa.
Sir, oy.
Sir, uy. Sige, si Roji na lang. Kasi siya may leader, no? Okay, Roji.
Ayaw no, sir. Diretso na percent. Ayaw no, sir.
Unsa man ni nga mga bata ni, uy?
I-guide lagi mi ni Lord, sir.
Okay. Sige, Junary na lang. Si Mandol na lang.
Kasama sa bata.
Mandol. Mandol. Kagrupo niyo si
Sir,
Mandol?
bawal yan.
Dili niyo kagrupo?
Dili sa pwede sa ila, sir.
Di na pwede siya. Si Ira na lang.
Buaira.
Ang leader mo dapat mag-pray, sir.
Mo gyud. I
Ayaw.
agree. Sige na.
Hindi man ako i-pray. Kajut lang.
Asa ka gapadulong, uy.
Ay, sira.
Mag-apo ra mga good.
Sigma.
Magtago siya.
Sige.
Mag-start. Mag-start na ta, sir.
Yes, sige na. Let's start.
Mag-pray pa ta, sir. Or
Of course.
present na may. Sige.
Oh,
Sige, for those Catholic, in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you, Lord, for this wonderful day nga imong gihatag sa namo tanan. And I hope nga i-guide mi nimo sa amo ang report karon. And kay tungod karon pandemic, always keep us safe and away from disease. All these things we ask through Christ our Lord. Amen.
amen. Oh,
Amen.
ampo man gani. Iabot na lang mukha ni si Japon
Sir.
mo.
Okay ka, sir. Ay.
Okay. Are we ready? Well, let's have a recap of what we have discussed in our previous session. May I ask Mandol? Kindly unmute yourself. What have you learned from our
Sir?
discussion? What have you learned from our discussion last week?
So, hello. Answer. During our previous lesson last week, what I've learned is all about what or where do international relation start.
What else? Orato? About Zinaida Naga. What have you learned from our discussions last week? Oy, bantay lang yun din kapanghawa ba? Ngano ni gamay naman eh. Ang ano ni hawa man. Ngano ni gamay. Mga Oh, Jacob, you're raising your hand. Yes, Jacob.
Sir, madugan ko, sir.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Uh, about what I learned last meeting, I learned that the European people is the enlightenment of every knowledge that we have right now, sir. Like for example, the trade, uh, kanang anong na ay what we call diplomacy, so on and so forth, sir.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you, Jacob. So, in our previous session, we've discussed about uh, the beginning of international relations and the turning point of the this or the starting point of international relations really is during the establishment of what treaty? Be? Sa nga treaty,
Sir,
Jacob. Yes, Jacob.
Westphalian, sir.
Okay. The Westphalian Treaty. No?
Westphalian treaty, sir.
Westphalian.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay, that's
Westphalian.
correct. So thank you, Jacob. So for this afternoon, Group 2 will discuss about diplomacy, right? So the group of Kabangbang, si Kabangbang, and then Baluarte Branzuela. I'm checking your attendance sa sa every group. Branzuela Say present me.
Yes, sir. Present.
Okay. Thank you. Kadungon, Kiza May.
Present, sir.
And then Caceres Jacob, okay na. So kompleto mo tanan. Very good. Very good group to, no? Okay, shall we start? Sige na, i-present natin yung PowerPoint, Roji. Okay, makita na i-play. Shall we start? Again, if you're the reporter, mo ang camera. Turn on your camera. Okay? Shall we start?
Sir,
Sir, ayun.
I-on. Sige, go.
sir, dili ko ka-open. Ako'y nagkuhan sa laptop, sir.
Oh, i-open mo ahead of time. Yung camera.
Ayun. Pwede naman, sir, no nga. Sa phone lang dayon ka mag-open.
Pwede. Unsa man ni laptop man ni, di ba?
Oh,
Oh. I-on dahan.
sige, sir, sa phone ra ko mag-kuhan.
Sige, go. Okay, shall we start, Junari?
Good afternoon, everyone. We are the Group 2. We will discuss what is diplomacy by the given reading of Sir Ian Nicholas. Next slide, please. So, before ko mag-kuan kung kisa si Carl von Clausewitz, ako i-discuss what is diplomacy ang ato nahibalaan. So, ang diplomacy is something that is international relations, the activities, problems, and other professions that would manage or represent each other countries. So, muna siya ang relations sa each countries ang diplomacy nga karabitang para mag-maintain sa peace and stability sa isa ka country or sa relations sa other abroad nga countries. So, who is Carl von Clausewitz? Next slide, please. Carl von Clausewitz is military theorist who remarked in the early 18s that war was the continuation of policy by other means. He sought to normalize the idea of war in modern politics. His words also indicated that actions short of war are available to help states achieve their objective. So sa una, di ba uso man ang war. So mo na nag-exist ang diplomacy in order nga hatag bitaw og peace and stability sa isa ka country para mastoryahan ang mga problema. So sa una is war man ang solusyon para makadaog ang isa ka country. So karon in the modern politics or modern na kuan, so nag-exist na dayon ang diplomacy. Next slide please. What is diplomacy? Diplomacy is system of structured communication between two or more parties, a process between actors, diplomats, usually representing state to exist within a system, international relations, and engage in private public dialogue, diplomacy to pursue their objectives in a peaceful manner. So, mo to siya, diplomacy in all means, they have to communicate to other countries to have a solution to the problem. Just like the recent problem the COVID-19. So in order nga makahatag og kanang solution sa problem is nagkuan og kanang vaccine na ang karon nag-release na og vaccine ang sana international na mga so sa kanang vaccine nagkuan gyapon og international nga relation para maka-release or ma-distribute siya nga equally. So it is not foreign policy and must be distinguished from it. Foreign policy has two key ingredients: its actions and its strategies for achieving its goals. So mo to siya ang diplomacy, mo na siya ang peacemaker sa isa ka relation sa other nga mga countries. So ang diplomacy is essential tool gyud siya para dili pala sa una nga ilan na lang ipaagi sa war pero karon pwede na istoryahan ang mga things. So next slide please. Being conducted for the most part between states. So naay mga kuan sa organizations just like international law that governs diplomacy. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations only references states as diplomatic actors. So kanin sa Vienna, nana sila yung muna siya ang relation between independent na mga countries. So naay mga diplomats. So karang nga mga diplomats, muna sila ang mga tao nga kanastorya bitaw sa ilang problem or concern sa ilang country without hesitation. So it specifies the privileges of diplomatics to perform their function without fear of coercion or harassment by the host country. So sila ang mga aktor nga magstorya sa mission sa isa ka country. So these tend to be international non-governmental organization and international governmental organization. So kaning international non-governmental organization mao ni siya ang kanang gamit og international nga scope nga diplomacy. Just like example is the Red Cross. Ang Red Cross is dili siya governmental pero large iyang scope. International siya bisag asa ang Red Cross ga exist. So ang IGOs mao ni siya ang governmental organization. So mao ni siya ang composed og sovereign states parehas sa United Nations. Wala siya ang pinaka-example nga organization ang United Nations. Kay in order to have a peace and stability sa international is nag-exist ang United Nations para ang mga ga-exist ng mga problems or kanang mga kuan sa economy is dali ra siya ma-resolve bitaw. Wala siya example sa diplomacy ng organization. Next is a silent process working along on its routine and often highly complex from carried out by rank and file diplomats and representatives. So, moto siya, to avoid war and conflict, na representatives ang isa ka states or a non-state nga mga actors. So in the other hand, ang public or ang people are the reason nga ang diplomacy on each country exists kay tanan man countries tayong mga problem. So because of its briefing statements that can be heard by gakadungog na siya sa ato ang mga sa atong kinataasan. So mao na siya nga ang problem na dayon sa just like our country Philippines madungog na dayon siya sa lain nga mga countries tungod kay nadungog man siya sa mga high nga mga officials. Next. Next slide, please. To enable the reader to get a sense of what diplomacy is and why it is important, this chapter will use to interrelated case studies, the case to manage the spread of nuclear weapons and U.S. relations for. So, kaning spread of nuclear weapons of U.S.-Iran relations, dara na kuan bitaw nag-exist na bitaw ang diplomacy. So to furthermore, ang next na nga reporter ang magkuan. Next dayon, Zay. The case studies were chosen as they offer a glimpse of diplomacy between states that were sworn economies and had a little in common due to incompatible economic, political, or even religious systems. Yet through diplomacy, they were able to avoid war and find ways to achieve progress in the most critical of areas. So mo to siya ang US, Iran ug ang nuclear nga mga weapons na sa na resolve ra siya tungod sa diplomacy. So ang next nga reporter ang maghatag na sa inyo og detailed nga mga kuan. So mara to, sir. Thank you.
Okay, next. Say next.
Iyang mic. Off iyang mic, sir.
Kinsa yung next, si?
Ako, sir.
Okay.
Kajut lang, sir. Okay.
Ako lagi.
Echo. Off mo.
Okay na. Ay, duwa ka ka-account?
Oh.
Murag iko gid siya. I-off na lang na. Cellphone mo na.
Cellphone.
Sa laptop na lang paggamit. I-off na lang ng sa phone. Dili ka maka-on og camera sa laptop. Okay na lang. Oh, naman lagi. Sige, go.
Makita ko, sir?
Yeah, madunggan po.
Okay.
Mag-anad na mo nga inani atong setup. Okay. Close mo lagi.
Yes, sir. Okay, next. Regulating nuclear weapons. So after the first use of an atomic bomb by the US and Japan in August 1945, the world was transformed. US dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, confirmed that the nature of warfare had changed forever. So after the first use of the atomic bomb by the US and Japan in August 1945, specifically sa Nagasaki ug sa Hiroshima, everything was changed. So every perspective of the people there was transformed. As one reporter described what happened, regular bombs can leave gutted buildings and framework still standing, while the atomic bombs leaves nothing at all. So anyone who could witness that time sa nuclear bomb will change their perspective. Then next is, so after US successfully detonated a nuclear bomb, nations has been attracted to it, and at the same time they started researching about the technology of the nuclear bomb. So these are the countries nga nakadetonate na og bomb after sa US. So Soviet Union in 1949, UK in 1952, the France in 1960, and China in 1964. There were genuine fears that these dangerous weapons would proliferate to other nations. So proliferation, which means rapid production. So this means rapid production of the nuclear weapon is happening that time. More powerful bombs are created, and at the same time, grave threat and danger to many nations has been ang nahitabo. So next is by the early 1960s, nuclear weapons had been built that could cause devastations for hundreds of kilometers beyond the impact zone. So United States and the Soviet Union, who were locked into a system of rivalry known as the Cold War. So these two states are having a race to outdo each other in terms of quantity and quality of bombs each possess. By that time, they are very competitive with each other, that it created the Cold War. So grabe gyud og kanang rivalry ang gakahitabo sa two nations, which is ang US ug ang Soviet Union that time. So the Cold War was known as such because the presence of nuclear weapons on both sides made a traditional war made between two almost unfathomable. So unfathomable, which means impossible to comprehend. So grabe gud ilang pakidisog that time. So next is nuclear weapons are primarily held as defensive tools unlikely to be ever used. Concept known as deterrence, by holding a weapon that can wipe out an opponent. Such an opponent is concept known as deterrence, by holding a weapon that can wipe out an opponent, and such an opponent is unlikely to attack you. So they're only getting ready or reserving their weapons if ever they will have a conflict with each other, and that concept created deterrence. So gahold sila og weapons, kusog na weapons if ever nga naay mahitabo nga conflict between sa two nations, which is ang US ug ang Soviet Union. So in Cold War, gaining a nuclear arsenal was a way to achieve deterrence and a measure of security that was otherwise attainable. So during Cold War, ang pag-gain sa nuclear arsenal means gaining deterrence and also gaining security. So each of them possessed bombs para maniguro sa ilang safety nila. Next one is to the brink and back. So the United Nations, or UN, which was created in 1945 in part of to give international diplomacy a focal point and create a more secure world, to attempt in vain outlaw nuclear weapons in the late 1940s. Weapons that were developed required fast detonations, released large amounts of radiation into the atmosphere, endangering ecosystems and human health. So the UN was created to develop international diplomacy or to create more secure world, and that time nagdevelop og kanang test sa bombs, and ang bombs ga-release siya og large amount of radiation, which is naka-endanger sa atmosphere og sa human health. So 1950s high level of diplomacy under United Nations framework had managed to establish a moratorium or suspension on nuclear testing by the United States and the Soviet Union. So by the 1961, a climate of mistrust and heightened tensions between the two nations caused testing to resume 1 year later in the year 1962. So during sa 1950s na suspend ang paghimo sa nuclear bomb, but kay tungod sa climate of mistrust o heightened tensions, atong nga time na-resume siya in the year of 1962, which is world came to the brink of nuclear war in what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is the root, the main idea of this part. So what happened to Cuban Missile Crisis? So I researched some timeline so that it is easier for us to understand and for me. Sure. So this Cuban Missile Crisis happened in the year 1959, 61, and 62. So I will focus to discuss in the year of 1962 because that is what ang ato ang handouts gakuan. So in August 10, 1962, Kennedy receives word that Soviet middle-range missiles are supposedly being based in Cuba. In August 31, there is evidence of Soviet missiles installations. In October 14th, U-2 flew over western Cuba and discovered missile sites. So U-2 is a plane for surveillance. And in 16th, Kennedy holds a meeting with advisors to discuss what action should be taken against Cuba. Then October 17, intermediate range nuclear missiles are discovered. So next, in October 18, Kennedy and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko meet. And 20th, Kennedy met with ExCom to discuss the speeches he was to give and the idea of blockade on Cuba. Then in 21, Kennedy decides on a quarantine of Cuba. Then October 22, Kennedy tells the public of the missile sites in Cuba in a televised speech. So in 23, Kennedy receives a letter from Khrushchev. Then 26, Khrushchev sends Kennedy another letter proposing to remove Soviet missiles if he publicly announces to never invade Cuba. So in 27th, an American U-2 was down over Cuba. A U-2 flew off course over Russia, and another letter was received from Khrushchev. Then in 28th, Khrushchev announces to remove all missiles from Cuba. Then in November, planes were officially removed and returned to the USSR. So, and in 21, Kennedy formally ended the quarantine. So the idea of this, so how did they resolve the Cuban crisis? So it is via diplomacy. So all in all, ang ilang pakig-away, almost war, kay wala man jud na dayon unless kung naagi nag-touch move ato nga time, kay madayon gyud ang nuclear war. But it did not because they resolved it via diplomacy. So up to this day, the Cuban Missile Crisis is regarded as the closest that the US has ever come to a nuclear war, and it was one of the defining moments of the Cold War. Next, reporter.
Okay, so I am the next reporter. So, mayong udto sa tanan. Okay, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So, this will be the agreement. So, known as the nuclear treaty. So, which is called nuclear weapons, also called nuclear non-proliferation treaty, an agreement of July 1, 1968, signed by the United Kingdom and United States and Soviet Union. So, kung maingon tag non-proli, which is mean kanang pagpugong sa pagdaghan sa weapon. So kung maingon tag proli, pagpasagad or kanang pasagdan nga modaghan ang weapons. So in 1970s, open with entering into force of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, muna siya ang mga tuig nga mas na-effect or nag-effect ang treaty, ang mao ang agreement nga nagay outcomes sa kuan sa pag-produce ani nga method. So the purpose is kuan anang to prevent uh, purpose ani is international treaty to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and supposed to promote cooperation in peaceful uses of nuclear energy and supposed to achieve the nuclear disarmament. So kuan kani siya nga treaty nag kuan gyud nag pugong nag mo ni siya ang method or instrument nga mahitabo nga dili mag-share og mga weapons sa nagkadaiya nga nasod. So next. So the treaty sought to channel nuclear technology into civilian uses and to recognize the establishing effect of further nuclear weapons proliferation on the international community. So kuan kato siya nga method or a treaty which is nga kuan nga dili ma-share ang mga nuclear sa civilian katong kanabitang mga nasod nga wala naka-produce og nuclear weapons. So muna siya nga gihimo ang treaty kaya aron kanang dili ma kuan ba into peaceful ra bitaw ang kuan ang international. So nagkadaiya nga country wala gyud mahitabo nga si tawag ani kanang war kung maghimo og kasabutan or treaty which is mao ni siya ang non-proliferation treaty. So next slide. So to freeze the number of nations that had nuclear weapons at the 5 nations which is already possessed them, which is the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, France, and China. So the purpose is mapugnan gyud ang nuclear weapons sa nagpossess na nga mga country mo ni siya ang mga nations or country nga na nanay nuclear weapons ang United States, Soviet Union, and France, China. So there are only 3 countries nga nag-refuse or wala nila gi take ang opportunity nga maka-appeal sa treaty mo ni ang mga countries India, Israel, and Pakistan. So next. The non-proliferation regime is not perfect. Of course, a situation based underlined by North Korea quest to proliferate despite international will. It is also a system with an inherent bias since a number of nations are allowed to have nuclear weapons simply because they were first to develop them, and these countries to be called regardless of their behavior. So sa experience sa North Korea, nagyoy dili perfect nga kuan nga kasabutan kay ang Korea na naka-real na obserbahan nila nga naaday bias nga gakahitabo kay tungod sa kuan sa weapons nga nay mga uban nation nga ni-appeal sa treaty but wala pa naka-produce og wala pa naka-develop og weapons, nuclear weapons. So wala sila nagkuan, wala nihawa sila, gi-withdraw nila ang ilang pagka-membro sa profile tungod kay kuan nagakahitabo ang bias. So nagi behavior nga dili insakto sa nagkadaiya nga nasod. So next slide. So when it comes in Iran and US, Iran's wider location known as the Persian Gulf was a region that contained the world's largest known pool of oil, the steady supply of which was vital for the fuel of Western-oriented economies. So ang Iran, ginoon siya before as a Persian Gulf kay tungod nag-produce or naa didto ang daghan nga resources sa oil sector. Muna siya nga gitawag siya Persian Gulf. So next slide. When Iran's king known as the Shah found himself sidelined by powerful left-leaning government, the United States, with a leg of British, conspired to restore him to power via a covert coup in 1953. So, kani siya nga story, kani siya nga scenario before, kaning kaning king nga nasa Iran mo ni si Shah nga kuan kanang nahitabo nga nagkigsabot siya sa kuan sa executive part sa government sa Iran ay sa United States and the British. Muna nga in 19 unsa to siya mga year na na nahimo nga ang Britain nag-iya sa oil sector sa Iran tungod kay gi-invest or gibaligya sa king sa Iran nga mao ni si Shah. So muna siya ang king. Before that, ang mga tao sa Iran nga kuan kanang dili gusto sa mga tao nga i-invest niya ang taang dili gusto sa mga tao nga ibaligya niya ang oil resources sa Iran. Muna nga ang mga tao gusto siya i-disline, ipahawa sa as of king pero wala nahitabo until nga na in kuan niabot ang mga time in 19 sa to nga mga year 1951 I think nga si ang prime minister na elect which is si Muhammad Mossadegh nga iyang plano gusto niya nga mabalik ang oil resources sa Iran which is in short ang Iran na mogamit sa ilang resources. Muna siya ang nahitabo before yana as a relationship between the United States and Iran. So next slide. Until in 1979 was a revolution of Islamic and United States. So akong basahon, this vision was shared by the United States which is arm Iran with advanced weaponry. So in this revolution ang United States gusto nila tabangan ang Iran pamaagi sa kanang advance of weapon or to produce develop a nuclear weapons basta mga nuclear energy. So muna siya ang gusto sa United States nga mahitabo sa Iran. But sa pagtabang sa US naaday likod nga condition or kanang bitawng ilo sa ilang pagtabang sa Iran. So ang gusto sa US no ang interest sa US nga dito sila magkuha og resource og kanang oil sectors nga ang oil industry bitaw sa Iran mabalik sa US muna ang kapalit sa ilang pagtabang nana ang nahitabo sa revolution sa Islamic before in 1979. So more details will reporting in next topic. So next reporter na.
Isa may next. emoji. Ano naman si Balwarte?
Kisha.
Si Jacob. Ay, Kisha guys.
Balwarte, si Branchuela, mana. Kabangbang. O, Kadungon. Kisha.
Kadungo na, sir.
Asa naman si Kisha? No, naman siya Drigina. Kisha? Nakabalik na siya. Your turn, Kisha May.
So, good afternoon, everyone. My topic is about the Iran hostage crisis. So, in November 1979, Iranian student invade U.S. embassy. So, nag-ato ang mga student dito and they capture U.S. personnel. So, i-capture nila ang U.S. personnel para himuon nilang hostage in exchange for Shah or Shaya. So, gusto sa taga-Iran people nga magbalik ang Shaya dito sa ilahang lugar para i-face niya ang mga crime nga iyang gibuhat dito. Ang Shaya nila is na residence dito sa US, which specifically is sa New York. So, since gi-hostage sa mga taga-Iran ang US personnel sa they already violating the key feature of diplomacy. So, hostage taking is defined as war crime under Geneva Conventions. So, gusto sa taga-Iran i-exchange ang ilang Shaya sa ilahang gipang capture nga personnel dito sa embassy. So, ang US, the United States reject Iran's demands when it became tense and lasted 444 days. So ang US dili sila sugot sa gusto sa Iran nga i-exchange ang Shaya og katong kay dili sila gusto mauna nga nag-tense og nagtaas ang ilang war into 444 days. So after ana nga issue naayo na nila sa 444 days, then the US and the Iran were severed until nuclear proliferation brought them to the same table over 30 years. So after 30 years, naanapod sila issue which is nuclear Iran. Next slide. So nuclear Iran. So the idea of Iran possessing nuclear weapons is controversial. So para sa taga-Iran, ang nuclear weapons is gamito nila for peaceful purposes only. Pero dili magtuo ang taga-US because sa ilahang issue tong niagi, which is the Iran hostage crisis. So ang taga-Iran, since na sila mga nuclear weapons, Iran is in signature of non-proliferation treaty. So it means na sila sa listahan sa dapat i-control ang ilahang mga nuclear power. So ang US they set a large goal. So ang ilahang goal is to secure regime change in Iran. So na sila plan, this would be done by demonstrating the might of US through invasion of Iran's neighbors. So, ang plan sa taga-Iran is unaho nila invade ang neighbor sa Iraq. Ang plan sa US, unaho nila invade ang neighbor sa Iran, which is Afghanistan sa east and Iraq sa west. Next slide, please. So, the idea of Iran possessing So, this would be done by demonstrating mao to gi-invade sa taga. So, kung ma-failed ang taga-US nga mapailis og regime ang mga taga-Iran nga which is unahon nila ang katong mga neighbor, kung ma-failed sila ato nga plan, ang ilang plano is kung unsa ilang gibuhat sa Afghanistan and Iraq, mao na lang pud ang ilang himuon sa taga-Iran. So kani siya, if that failed, US was prepared to engage with Iran in some fashion in order to destroy its nuclear research facilities. So dira na dayon nag-appeal ang ang three countries sa sa Europe. So candidate enter the gray. So that's UK, Germany, and France. So ang ingon sa mga taga UK sa UK, Germany, and France sa taga US is ayuhon sa Iran ang ang ilang issue sa US through diplomacy. So engage Iran in diplomacy pero ang US ang dili mo sugot about ana. Kay na gusto nila ang ilahang goal ang ilahang sundon. So until 2006 na talk ang Europe ug ang Iran. So nag-apil dira ang US. So they join Euro-Iran talks in 2006 including China, Russia. So that's making it truly international diplomacy. So nag-apil na dito ang China and ang Russia. Next slide. So sa 2006 nila nga giistorya, nag-agree lang ang taga-US sa tong 2015. So ang ilang agreement is Marvel Diplomacy. So Marvel Diplomacy based sa akong gi-research is kanang mangita sila og solutions if ever magka-issue ang Iran ug ang US otro, mangita sila og solution nga duha sa ila ay agree sila both side, dili nga ang isa lang ka side. So mauna ang agreement of Marvel Diplomacy. So while gihimo sila atong talks, they discover some personal relationship of diplomats will also build. So before sila nag-agree sa diplomacy, naa pa sila gisabot, which gisabutan duha ka place. So to make acceptable for the both sides. So ang Iran, they want to remove the sanctions. So ang sanction sa ilaha is mga terorista. Then ang military threat sa US sa ilaha. So ang US sad gusto nila ang mga taga-Iran is strict regime verification to ensure that it cannot easily develop nuclear weapons. Next slide. So kung wala tong duha ka tulo ka kuan tong UK, France and Germany wala na himo og solusyon ang kuan. So kana lang akong report, that's all.
So good afternoon, everyone. So what is written about the conclusions dito sa given literature is very short. So there are something lang siguro that I append para mataas-taas siya gamay. Madunggan ganin niya?
Yes, Jacob.
Sige. Sige na lang ko ipang-ada ni. So diplomacy in modern era, an era sometimes called the long peace. So we would then be asked, what is the reason why we are called as a long peace? Diba? If when we review the dreadful history that happened during 1945 and sa mga ubos pa ng mga years, we would then understand why it is called so. Diba? During that time, those powerful countries keep conquering those relative countries, neighboring countries to build a empire. Okay, mostly of them is an empire, and then the goal of the empire is to have an extensive land. Yan na siya. And then there's a lot of major war pagyapon between the American and the Union Soviet Socialist Republic, American and the Japanese, napay World War I, World War II, etc. And then, do you think there is another major war that happened that go beyond 1945 until now? Di ba, wala na. Because of the word diplomacy. We will then see what is the effectiveness, how effective does the diplomacy is. Di ba, instead of having a war, they are having a talk. Kaya naman, they're having a talk to eliminate destruction. Inaana na siya. Therefore, it does connotes that the advent of diplomacy across countries is very effective. Inaana. Understand? Next slide, please. So, important purposes of diplomacy. So if when we go profound into the context of diplomacy, we will understand what is their purpose. And then the most convenient or very easy comprehend, context of diplomacy is it is the relationship between two or more parties. inana, and then the diplomats is referred to a person. And the example lang ng diplomats is the ambassadors, prime minister, so on and so forth. So the first is to maintain the peace and order between countries. Every country have their own government. And then, what is the primary goal of the government? If when we review the Intro to Social Science na subject, ma-understand na sila kay it was written in there that the primary function of the government is maintaining internal order and external security. So, sulod dara ang diplomacy. Inana. So, the next is trade, culture, wealth, knowledge. Trade is the reason why there is a economic growth of a country. If when we review the previous reporter about sa Europe, we wouldn't understand. Okay? Dito man nag-start ang trade. They are building a strong rapport with the other countries so that they have a trade. Inana. About po sa culture, ang example ano sa culture is ang katong dito sa Thailand silang sir. I don't think if it is a non-governmental diplomacy or governmental sila, okay? They are going in there to have an exploration with the Thailand culture. I don't think if kanang sakto ba na siya, sir. So, wealth and knowledge. About sa knowledge, sa diplomats about knowledge, if when we review about katong sa Marcos regime, have you heard about, there's a lot of students nga from ASEAN nga nag-eskwela diri sa Philippines during the Marcos regime. Okay? They are having the government to government having a talk para ang mga estudyante dito nag-eskwela sila diri. But what happened ato is gibaryan ang mga teacher nga dito na lang magtudlo sa ilaha. Muna ang nakuha nato nga culture sa muna problema sa what we call mga teachers sa una. Kaya nasina sila sa kwarta. Nga di dito lang, whereas kung diri pa to sila mag-teach, dagan pa lang ang mga benepisyo. Inana. So the next is to ensure that our period of long peace will get longer. So like what is being said about katong Westphalian Treaty, 30 years na siya. So, ang nakachad lang we will not just stick into long peace lang. As possible, we are looking about kanang forever peace, di ba? External peace, infinite peace, etc. Dapat daw na siya. So, the next is interest. Once we inuntag interest, every diplomats, every country have an interest. To maintain peace, it is an interest. Trade, it is interest. Peace, di ba? Tanan na siya, it's a matter of interest. Either their interest is in a malice purpose or in good purpose. Sa kining what we call malice purpose, like what happened in the Spratly. Have you heard about the Spratly and China? Sorry. An interest si Trillanes is going to China 10 times and more than 10 times. He have a talk with the Chinese government, and then right after that nag-build na dayon sila og infrastructure diya sa Spratly, and that is an example of malice purpose because that is a governmental man nga government man ta siya sa na property. Inana. For the good, and next is for the good of all individuals. Every talk that they have done is for the goods of individuals. Tanan, maintain peace. It is for the individual. Kung ang trade, technology, it is a trade. So it is for the goods of individuals. So tanan nga gibuhat sa diplomacy, it is for the goods of the people within the state. Ana. So next slide, please. So, a reason of having a nuclear weapons and why this must be regulated. So, first is defense, offense, or security. Kaya nga naman, if there is a country na murag makipag-away, and then this will serve as an offense. As an offense. And then the next is intimidation. Di ba? Those countries that have possessed a nuclear weapons is kadukan. Di ba? Like for example, kita og ang China. Because they possess the nuclear weapons, mahadlok ta. Wala tayo choice sa to ang island, probably. Wala na tayo choice kay they are very strong country when it comes to weapons. So mahadlok na lang ta. We don't have a choice with our own land. Inana na siya. Like for example, like if we have a nuclear weapons, do you think the Chinese people will easily invade our island? Di ba? Really, that is the advantages of having a nuclear weapons. Inana. Do you think Chinese will go to the America? Invade America? Dili. Because naaman sila yung nuclear weapons. So, may naka-advantage if you have a nuclear weapons kahadlukan ka. Whereas those people that does not possess a nuclear weapons can be easily persecuted by those who have power or can be easily oppressed by those na nag-possess ani. So inana. So why this must be regulated? Very destructive. Like what happened in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It leaves nothing. Diba? It leaves nothing according to the anchorman, a reporter. So inana. So who is the regulator ani? It was being talked lately nga ang United Nation. United Nation. And then it is a war between the US and the Union Soviet Socialist Republic. I-stop nila ang war, i-stop nila ang katong pagpadaghan sa nuclear weapons. Kung muna ginatawag din nato nga Non-Proliferation Treaty. Once we say gani na treaty, it refers to convention. Convention is an agreement, and it's a matter of ano na siya, synonymy. And then the only countries that possess the nuclear weapons are one, China, US, Union Soviet Socialist Republic, France I guess, and China. And China, sama to sila, ang five countries na nag-possess ani weapons. And then it's very confusing lang kay those countries have the right of veto power sa United Nations. Di ba, kakarius man na? Kung kinsa pa ang nag-possess ani na pa sila right sa veto power. By the way, speaking of veto power, napod tayo veto power dito sa Philippines. And then the only person that have the authority of veto power is the president. Nadilang ako na-extend. So the countries lang ang wala nag-sign sa Non-Proliferation Treaty are the country of Israel, Pakistan, and India. India already have created it recently lang, I guess. Wala 2017, 2018. Kaya mo na sila nuclear weapons, whereas the Israel already have their own nuclear weapons karon. But di lang makita because their weapons is located in underground. So di siya makita, even satellite di pa makita. So inana. So next slide please. As today's world is more linked and interdependent than ever before, effective and skillful diplomacy is vital to ensure that humankind can navigate an ever-growing list of shared challenges such as climate change, pandemics, transnational terrorism, and nuclear proliferation that may be our undoing if left unresolved. Actually, it's very easy, it's very cool to understand the word diplomacy nga, kanang diplomacy, kanang pag-reinforce naman na para may stop ang war. But no, it's a matter of naad na po siyang challenges, so is climate change. Ang example sa climate change is ang katong kaning Treaty Paris. The Treaty Paris is related to the climate change nga mag-less ang kanang paggamit sa mga manufacturers. Mag-less. Whereas pag ng Duterte ato nga time, yarang gi-revoke ang treaty. Kay disadvantage magud siya it's very disadvantage to those developing country. So na climate change, pandemics. An example of the pandemics is what happened now. There are those countries that we are allied or atong connection they are giving the Filipino people of vaccine. So nga na ang example. Transnational terrorism, example, and nuclear proliferation that maybe are undoing it left unresolved. So that's it, sir. 30, okay.
Okay, so are you done? Manata?
Okay na, sir.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Kindly stop sharing, Miss Rogin. Oh, questions from your classmates from the class. Any questions? Anyone who has a question? Kinsa, naipangutan na. Shinab.
Ako, sir.
Jalil. Okay, Mandol. Yes, you are recognized.
So, sir, based sa mga reporters, they all tackle about the positive effect of diplomacy. So, my question is, in today's pandemic, what is the negative effect of diplomacy?
Okay. What are the positive effects of diplomacy today? Okay. Who can answer that question? Anybody from group 2? Naa ba?
Sir, would you mind if you will go ahead to repeat your question?
What are the negative effects of diplomacy, especially today in this time of pandemic?
In my own speculation, sir, the most negative, kanang impact of diplomacy when it comes to the situation na like pandemic is katong mga, like for example, they're having a talk with those country nga murag lahi ang ilahang vaccine is not credible. And what if mag-avail tato silahang vaccine? So what do you think will happen if kana nga vaccine is not tested? So people in the Philippines will die. Inana na siya. That is just based on my speculation siguro. Tinapaiyan mo ang mga group mates.
Yes, thank you, Jacob. But of course, our government will take precautionary measures, before a vaccine will be implemented in our country. Of course, our country doesn't have a capacity to make its own vaccine against the virus. That's why we are using our good diplomatic relationship with other countries, so that they will help us in this situation that we are facing right now. Of course, we have able to establish a good diplomatic relationship with our neighboring countries, not only in Southeast Asia, but of course, most especially the West, okay? The European states as well as the United States. That's why they're the one that really helping us. Of course, to mention also our neighboring country, China. Okay? That's why diplomacy is very important. Since the concept of nation state was established. That's why, if you observe, based on the report kanina, the conflicts that arise during the period right after the Second World War was, kumbaga, na-stop siya due to a diplomacy. Okay? Good establishment of a good relationship with other states or other countries. That's why, although when we talk of diplomacy, we are not only talking about your relationship with another state. It is explicitly um, provided in the book that even non-state actors, when we talk of non-state actors, I am referring to international organizations such as EU or European Union, United Nations, ASEAN, APEC. These are not states, right? They are international organizations, but they are vital in shaping the dynamics of our international relations because they widely influence the way our government is being kumbaga, run. Okay? Like for example, of what is agreed in the international United Nations is being applied in our country, di ba? So ang mga policies sa kani nga mga international governmental and even non-governmental organizations are being applied in our country. Okay? So inana siya. So was there a negative effect of diplomacy? Because I think that is the main point of Jalel, di ba? What do you think? Napaka? Of course, na. There are always two sides of the coin. Mm-hmm. What do you think? Yes,
Sir,
Jacob? Mhm.
if nalang siya siguro negative if the diplomats have a negative interest lang siguro, sir.
Kung
Like,
ang diplomat, by the way, I will just give
nasa
you, let's put this into a context. Who are the diplomats in the Philippines? Anyone from the group? Pinsang matawag na diplomats. Because
sir,
a, the country just cannot just appoint or select anyone to be because if you are a diplomat, you're representing the government of a state, right? You're representing the government of a state. For instance, the Philippines, if you are a diplomat assigned in the United States, then you are representing the government of the Republic of the Philippines. If you wanted to be a diplomat, there are two ways. Okay, you will be politically appointed, or you underwent the rigors to become a foreign service officer, FSO. Okay, so usually a diplomat is politically appointed. I'm referring to an ambassador. Okay, so they are, when we talk of political appointments, they are decisions made by the chief executive, and that is the president in our case. So, of course, the head of uh, the diplomats in our country, of course, is the president of the republic. However, the president of the republic appoints a secretary to the Department of Foreign Affairs, who is the chief diplomat of our country. And the chief, the secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs has oversee the power to control and oversee all diplomatic relations of our country to other nation states. So we have the ambassador to the United States, the ambassador to the United Kingdom, okay, being appointed by the President of the Republic. But in our case, although they are appointed by the President of the Philippines, but it must undergo a series of validation being done by the Senate as the oversight institution that will look at the capacity, the educational attainment, whether or not, as what Jacob said a while ago, dapat dili siya mag-traitor sa ato ang nasod. That is why the Senate is the one that will screen. Ga-screen sila, ilang tanahon ba, qualified ba ka ni siya, mahimong ambassador as our representative to Saudi Arabia, to Bahrain, etc. Okay? Manang makita ninyo sa news, okay, na yung mga appointments sa tuwang president na dili siya mapadayon, dili siya ma-approve. Kaya naman, the Congress, na sila gitawag na Commission on Appointments or CA. Okay? The CA is a very powerful political body in Congress which is composed of 12 members of the CA or the Commission on Appointments is coming from the Senate, and another 12 members are coming from the lower house. Okay, that is part of the kumbaga checks and balances ba sa ato ang constitution. Nga dili lang tanan ang president ang mag-decide in terms of our foreign relations. Okay? So every time that a president will appoint an ambassador, the commission and appointment will see to it that he is fit. Okay? Fit for the job to be a representative, because you are somehow bringing the name, of course, bringing the name of our country to establish a rapport, to establish relationship. Okay? And that is in our part, in the case of our country. When we appoint foreign service officers or again diplomats to other country, only ambassadors under the Constitution will undergo the process in the Commission on Appointments. Okay. Now, the reporters made mention about the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Yes, that's correct. So in 1960, kano sa to siya na-approve 1964, 1961.
1961, sir.
Yeah. That was Jonary's report, no? The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations on 1961 is the one that governs how every country will establish diplomatic relations with another country. And it was signed by many countries who are members also of the United Nations. Kaya kung gusto ka mag-establish og good good relationship with another country, di ka dapat manghimasok sa ilahang somehow internal affairs. Mo na ang isa sa mga points. Like for example, okay, katong report kagaina, sa itong nag-report nga ang head of mission sa Iran, ang head of mission is ilahang gi-hostage. No, kana. That is a very big no-no. It is because ang tanan nato nga mga embassy, this is true to all country ha. If in the Philippines na ay US Embassy, right? Na siya sa Manila. Ang pinakaduol diri nga diplomatic mission diri sa Bukidnon naa sa Davao, na ay consular office dara sa Japan, sa Indonesia, o sa China. Okay? So na mga consul dara. Okay? Na mga consul. Later on, tagaan ta mo og kuan kanang sitawag ani nomenclature kinsa ang pwede mahimong kinsa ang mga tao sa isa ka diplomatic mission. So of course, ang pinakataas is ang ambassador. Okay? Ambassador, plenipotentiary, siya ang usually pinakataas nga head sa mission. Although, naay mga instances nga kasagara in our case ay taga-send og ambassador sa kay ang mga Pilipino bisag asa sa kalibutan na ay mga Pilipino, di ba? Naidaghan kayo, luag lapad kayo ang population sa mga Pilipino aning specific location. Like for example, United States. So, sa United States, daghan ta og diplomatic mission, dili lang ambassador, dili lang ang sa New York ang ato ang diplomatic mission. So nasa Chicago, sa San Francisco, pero ang pinaka-head nila is the ambassador nga naka-station sa Washington DC. But in San Francisco, in Chicago, na mga consul. They are somehow mga gagmay nga, but in terms of position mas under sila sa ambassador, mga consul. So in Davao na ay consular office dara ang Chinese embassy, including the Japanese embassy na sila consular office dara. Diya ka pwede uh, sila depende sa ilahang mission, either political or economic, okay? Inana, depende. And because of course, if there is a diplomatic relation, naiduulan ang imuhang mga citizen. E dito sila mga tabang kung naa sila'y problema, di sila mag-renew sa ilahang passport or dira magkuha og visa ang mga foreigner nga gusto mosulod sa inyuhang nasod. That is the primary purpose nganong na isa sa mga primary purpose nganong na ay diplomatic missions. Okay? So like for example, if you want to go to the United States, you cannot just simply buy a ticket and have a passport. You cannot enter their borders without a visa. So asa man ka magkuha? Of course, you go, you apply. Ato ka sa, and there's an interview in their diplomatic mission sa Manila if you want to apply in the United States visa. So inana siya. So because of these diplomatic missions, isa sa mga positive effect is there is an international migration, international travel, etc. Isa lang na siya sa daghan kaayo nga positive effect aside from katong inyong report kagay na si reporter to stop and war, conflict, etc. But in this modern time, these diplomatic missions has many functions and effects because somehow they are representing a country, okay, from one country to another country. So inana siya. Any questions? Napa? So sir, unsaon ko para mahimo mig diplomat? Are you interested? Is gusto, interested na mahimong member of the diplomatic corps? Ano nga, if gatanaw mo balita, every natay bag-o nga president or every SONA, makita ninyo isa sa mga audience sa president during the SONA are the members of the diplomatic corps. Muna sila ang mga representatives, mga ambassador, mga head of missions coming from other countries because they are representing their country in our country. So another is during anang celebration sa ato ang anang every June 12. Tawag na.
Independence Day.
Yeah. Independence Day, there is a gathering in Malacanang and the president will host a Vendi Honor. Anong Vendi Honor? That is a gathering of the members also of the diplomatic corps in Malacanang celebrating our Independence Day, etc. They establish socializing para they can establish a connection, etc. Siya. So there are many positive of course you cannot also deny the fact that there is a negative effect of having a diplomatic relation, but mas daghan para sa kuha ang positive effect kana sila mo nang pag-establish na to og diplomatic relation with other country mo na ang gahatag og way nga makaadto pud ta sa ilahang nasod kumbaga inana. So like for example, North Korea, okay? There is no embassy in the Philippines nga a North Korean embassy, only South Korean. So limited or as to walay makaadto sa North Korea because there is no diplomatic relationship ang Pilipinas ug ang North Korea. Nana. Whereas sa South Korea na sila embassy sa Pilipinas. So if you want to apply for a South Korean visa para gusto ka mo to sa ilaha, then pwede. Kaya naman available siya diri sa ato ang nasod. And another thing So there are countries in the world which we establish good diplomatic relations nga galaw sila o free visa sa mag-visit sa ilang nasod aside from the 10 countries in the ASEAN. So, like for example, Taiwan. Okay, 2 years ago, um, Taiwan released a statement that they will allow a Filipino passport to enter their borders up to 7 days, I think. Just research lang ninyo. 7 days for tourism purpose. Okay, walay other kuan, walay other because of course when you go to other country, di man pwedeng sagon sa imong rason, di ba? If you want leisure, tourism, pwede na siya. But wadto ka dito mangita kag trabaho, then you must have a working visa, working permit, dili lang tourism. Kinamay na, di ba? Kabalo man gyud mo na. Di ba nga marama ng mga Pilipino. Niadto og Dubai, pero ang iyang visa nga gikuha 30 days na visiting tourist visa. Pero katong nga 30 days iyahang gamit nga makapangita siya og trabaho, etc. Inana. So siguro kana or uban is human trafficking. Okay? Kana siya negative effect pud na siya ang human trafficking. Kana bang ibaligya ang tao didto, etc. himo og slave or himuon og illegal worker na walay papers, etc. Inana siya. So bawal pud na siya. That is governed by naidaghan kayo nga mga international agreements nga ga prohibit sa human trafficking. Okay? So kanang mga illegal recruiter, of course, kuan na sila, naka-violate na sila sa Anti-Human Trafficking Act. Nana siya diri sa ato ang balaod sa Pilipinas and sa ubang nasud. Okay? So inana. And it is governed by proclaimed by the United Nations kanang anti-human trafficking. Okay? At sa pa, of course, katong mga conflict, US between Iran, US, Cuba, and USSR, these conflicts that happened during the Cold War or right after the Cold War was stopped or even prevented due to diplomatic relations. So instead that they will result to war, just like what happened in the previous years prior to 1945, instead nga ang mga nasud once na sila'y conflict, they will result to war, di ba? So mama na ang sa report sa previous group o even kaninga group that there is really war, but this war is being stopped or prevented due to establishment of good diplomatic relationship with another states. Inan. Questions? Okay pa mo? Okay ra mo sa ato ang subject?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Ga-enjoy mo sa ato ang subject? Wala. Wala. I-drop
Enjoy
na lang
kayo.
ninyo.
Enjoy, sir. Enjoy.
I-drop na lang. Joke. Okay. So, muna, kinanglan kita magbasa, no? Magbasa ta sa libro na akong gi-provide. I know, dili to siya makasuffice. Kung gusto, you must be a, kumbaga, wide reader ba? Kumbaga, ilang mo mag-limit sa, say, gipakaon or gihatag sa inyo sa inyong instructor. Magbasa-basa, magmananog balita, kinaman mo sa international relations, not only news coming from the Philippines, but including abroad, di ba? Kanang balita sa CNN, sa BBC, Al Jazeera, para makabantay po mo sa mga balaod sa ubang nasod nga possible maka-affect sa ato ang nasod, di ba? Inana. Kapa? Wala na? So thank you very much, Group 2, no? For your effort, for your dedication, dedication in your report. Okay. I hope that other group will go on mag-practice po dug tanan maka-report no just like group 2. Maningkamot ba? Exert og effort, maningkamot nga maka-report, di ba? Ano ako gusto ng estudyante. Anang mag-effort po dili kay puro ra kuan excuses ba. Di ba?
Open cam na tanan, sir.
Oh, open cam na kay gusto na ko makita inyong mga hulagway o
I mean, sa reporting sa tanan, sir ba?
kasi si Baning Uban, si Mandol.
Sana all.
Sana all daw, yung ni Jacob Mandol. Yes, open cam na ta perminti pag mag-record. Pag-record bang good na kung mag-close kaya ako man gina-record no, kaya ako man gina-post dito sa ato ang YouTube para katong dili maka-attend sa atong online class. Sila. Kay kung wala manggoy kuan dili pud pag na mag-report dili makita nga kinsay nga report, di ba? Na-observe ninyo na. So kung kinsa tong ga-report siya po din ang mag-open sa camera para na siya space dito sa ubos ba makita yung dagway, di ba? Kaya picture na ta.
Maratong sa balik sa katong sign language.
Oh, mura ka ginad to. Tong sign language. Kaya attendance. Kaya ako ba ning gina-record din yung attendance diri oh. Na may attendance diri. So katong permitting appeal sa ako ang online class na quad plus points. Char. Pareha kang Shinab, butan. Awato ninyo si Shinab, si Kisha, Kadungon, kani sila Mandol, Jacob, mga perminti ako ni sila makita sa akong klase. Si Neil, sapat akong kakita sa perminti sa akong klase. Si Mary Rose, si Jackie Love, bisag hinay ang iyang internet, magsulod yun na siya. Diba? May kamot nga, balag dagang gatok tugaok, makasulod. Okay. Kaning uban, nga nung wala man ni camera, kaya magkuhan ako, mag-screenshot para makita na ko nga attendance. Okay. Ready? 1, 2. Dili ko kas open sa camster kay guba. Sige, kaya ng guba. Oh, tanawa si Zenaida, nanay baby. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Isa pa. Isa pa. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay. So, thank you. Okay. So, group 3. Kisa itong group 3? Si Kome. Nawala naman si Kome. Kome ba?
Sana all naka-uniform ko.
Isa yung group 3 dire.
Ako, sir.
Liza, kumusta man yung preparation?
Ay, nag-prepare na kami, sir. Mag-meet kami sa morning ugma.
Ugma. Okay. So, I will just post next week our schedule, ha? Ay na ni magod gusto kong mahuman nataba para before pa sa end of the semester makahuman na ta para dili kayo makakuan. I know you also have other requirements sa uban nga subject so that dili kayo pag-abot dito sa last dugay na mo makasubmit sa mga requirements. Okay? So pag human nato aning tanan na presentation, so we are free na dayon buhat nang dayon mo requirements. Okay? So I hope with the group 2, group 3 and group 4 will present next week. Okay? Group 3 and Group 4 so that umano dayon makatunga na ta. Okay? So prepare Group 3 and Group 4 next week ha. Pero of course, dili na same nga day. Kuha na to na siya, tungaon. I will just kuan. Maybe ang isa Wednesday, ang isa dayon either Thursday or Friday. Ina na. Okay? So, I think that's all for today. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye,
Bye,
sir.
sir. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye.
Sir.
Thank you.
Mm-mm.
Bye, bro.